When my husband told me his father was sick, I didn't hesitate for a second. I opened our home, rearranged our lives, and promised to take care of him as if he were my own blood. For months, I cleaned, cooked, and nursed a man who barely remembered my name, but I never complained. What I didn't know was that the same kindness that kept our family together was the very thing that would destroy my life. Because the man I took care of, the man I trusted with everything, ended up stealing the roof over my head. It was late autumn when Richard told me his father, Henry, had nowhere else to go. Henry was in his late 70s, his body frail, his memory fading. Richard's mother had passed years ago, and his sister lived across the country. Just for a few months, my husband said, avoiding my eyes as he folded his jacket. I agreed, of course. What kind of person would I be to say no? Besides, we had a spare room, and the thought of an old man alone in a nursing home broke my heart. Henry arrived 2 weeks later. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his skin pale, his eyes distant. He barely spoke to me, but when he did, his words carried a sharp edge. At first, I thought it was just the illness talking, but sometimes when Richard wasn't around, I'd catch a glimpse of something colder behind those cloudy eyes, a kind of quiet resentment. Still, I did my best. Every morning, I made him tea, I changed his sheets, I sat by his bed listening to him mumble about better days, and slowly he started to trust me, or at least I thought he did, until one day I overheard him talking to Richard in the living room. "I never liked her. You married beneath you, son. This house would have been better off in your name alone." I froze. The tea I was carrying trembled in my hands. I wanted to run, to scream, but instead I smiled and brought it in like I hadn't heard a thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. And deep down, a strange feeling began to grow. The quiet suspicion that my kindness was being tested and that I was already failing. The weeks that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Henry started joining Richard in the evenings, sitting beside him in the living room as they watched old westerns and talked about family matters. I could never quite catch what they said, but the moment I entered the room, the conversation stopped, like a candle blown out by the wind. At first, I tried to believe it was just father and son catching up, but then small things began to change. Richard stopped asking about my day. He started locking the drawer where we kept our paperwork. And when I brought up the house bills, something we always handled together, he brushed me off with a tired sigh. "I'll handle it." He said, "Dad thinks we've been overspending." Dad thinks. 2 words that started haunting me. Henry began walking around the house with a sense of ownership, like every creak in the floorboards belonged to him. He moved the family photos, rearranged furniture, even criticized the meals I cooked. Once, when I brought him dinner, he stared at the plate and said, "In my day, wives didn't serve cold food to their husbands." I wanted to remind him that I wasn't his wife, but the bitterness stuck in my throat. Richard didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. He started coming home later from work, always distracted, always tired, and every night, Henry seemed to whisper something new into his ear. I could feel it, The shift in loyalty, subtle but sharp. The man I loved was slipping away, guided by a voice that had never accepted me. Then, one morning, while cleaning Henry's room, I found a stack of documents on his nightstand. Papers with our names on them, mine and Richard's, typed across the top. It was a property form, something about title transfer. My stomach turned. When I asked Richard about it that evening, his face went pale. He said Dad's just helping us with some legal stuff, forcing a smile. Helping us? I repeated, or helping you? That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, because for the first time since Henry moved in, I realized my home was no longer mine. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy, even before the day begins. I was in the kitchen, packing Richard's lunch, when a knock echoed from the front door. 2 men in suits stood outside, calm, polite, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Taylor?" one asked. "We're here regarding the property ownership verification." I frowned, glancing back at Richard. He looked nervous. "I'll handle it," he said, stepping forward. But I didn't move. "What property verification?" I asked. The man hesitated, then handed me a folder. Inside were papers, dozens of them, all stamped, all signed. At the bottom of the last page, right beside Richard's signature, was Henry's, and mine was missing. My breath caught. "What is this?" Richard's eyes avoided mine. "Dad said it would be temporary. He just wanted to make sure the house stays in the family in case something happens to us." "In case something happens to us?" I interrupted. "Richard, it's our home!" But he didn't answer. He just stared at the ground like a child caught lying. Henry appeared from the hallway, leaning on his cane, wearing that smug half-smile I'd come to dread. "Don't look so shocked, dear," he said softly. "You've done your part. Now let a man handle what's his." My knees weakened. I wanted to scream, to tear those papers apart, but I couldn't move. Because in that instant, I realized it wasn't just betrayal. It was calculation. Weeks of manipulation, whispered lies, and forged trust had led to this very moment, and I had let it happen under my own roof. Later that night, Richard tried to comfort me. He said things like, "You're overreacting," and "Dad just wants security." But the words rang hollow, stripped of warmth. The man I loved for 15 years was gone, replaced by someone who valued inheritance more than honesty. And as Henry's laughter echoed from the guest room that used to be ours, I knew something inside me had died that day too. For days, I lived like a ghost in my own house. I cooked, cleaned, smiled when spoken to, but inside, I was crumbling. Henry had moved his things into the master bedroom, claiming it was easier for his health. Richard didn't protest. He just nodded, like a loyal son following orders. Each night, I slept in the guest room that once belonged to Henry, the same room where I had nursed him through fever and weakness. Now, it smelled of betrayal, a bitter mix of old medicine and lies. I thought about leaving, but where would I go?
Everything I had built was tied to this house. Every memory, every sacrifice, every heartbeat. So, instead of running, I began to observe. I noticed how Henry spoke to Richard, calm, controlling, always planting guilt. He'd say things like, "Your wife doesn't understand family," or, "You know she'll take half if things go wrong." And Richard, blinded by loyalty, believed him. One evening, as they sat in the living room, I quietly recorded their conversation with my phone tucked behind a curtain. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was proof. "Sign it, son," Henry's voice murmured. "Once it's done, no one can take it from you." Richard hesitated. "She'll find out, Dad." "She already has," Henry said, "and she's too soft to do anything about it." My hand trembled as I pressed stop. For a moment, I felt an ember of something new. Not anger, not sadness, but resolve. The next morning, I went to see a lawyer, a woman named Mrs. Klein, calm and sharp-eyed, who listened without interrupting. When I played the recording, she leaned back and sighed. "They can't take the house without your signature," she said, "but they did transfer it using a power of attorney, one that appears forged." I blinked. "Forged?" She nodded slowly. "It's illegal, but proving it will be messy. Do you have anywhere to stay if things get worse?" I thought about it, about my parents long gone, my friends distant, my savings low. "No," I whispered. "This is my only home." Mrs. Klein looked at me for a long moment. "Then we'll fight," she said, quietly, patiently. "Let them think they've won." And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope, fragile, trembling, but alive. Because if Henry believed I was too soft to fight back, he was about to learn how wrong he was.
Weeks passed, and I played my part well. I smiled when Henry mocked me. I nodded when Richard repeated his father's words as if they were gospel. And at night, when they thought I was asleep, I gathered every document, every bank statement, every trace of their deceit. Mrs. Klein worked quietly behind the scenes. She advised me to stay calm, to let them dig their own grave. And they did, faster than either of us expected. Henry had always been proud, but pride can't pay bills. He started using the house as collateral for a small business loan, something about restoring his legacy. Only the legacy was a lie, and so was his credit. Soon, the bank began calling, asking for verifications, signatures, and the trail led straight back to the forged documents. One afternoon, while Richard was at work, 2 bank officers came by. Henry answered the door, puffed up with arrogance. But when they asked for me, Mrs. Taylor, the co-owner of the property, his face drained of color. He stammered something about me being out of town, but they insisted on leaving papers that required my signature. That was the moment he realized his empire was built on sand. That evening, Richard came home furious, waving the bank letters in the air. "What did you do, Dad?" Henry snapped back. "I did what you didn't have the courage to do, protect this house from her." Their voices echoed through the walls like thunder. I stayed at the top of the stairs, silent, listening. Every cruel word he'd spoken about me, every seed of poison he'd planted, now turned on him. Richard shouted, "You used me. You used all of us." and Henry, trembling, hissed back, "I made you a man." It ended with the sound of a door slamming, Richard leaving, Henry collapsing into the chair, alone. Days later, the bank seized what was left of his assets. The forged power of attorney had triggered an investigation, and when the lawyers came asking questions, it was my evidence, my recordings, my patience that spoke the loudest. Henry was forced to leave. Richard, ashamed and broke, moved out soon after, too humiliated to face me. When the papers were finally settled, the house was returned to my name. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something I had built with love, watching justice rise from the ashes. After the storm passed, silence filled the house. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that echoes through empty rooms, heavy with what's been lost. I walked through every corner, touching the walls, the furniture, the photos that once held meaning. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was. Henry was gone. He moved into a small care facility on the other side of town, paid for by what little was left of his savings. The last I heard, he spent his days staring out a window, talking to no one. Some said his mind began to fade soon after, that he forgot names, faces, even the lies he'd built his life around. As for Richard, he tried to apologize once. He showed up on the porch one rainy evening, drenched and trembling, holding a small box. Inside was my wedding ring, the one he'd taken off me the day I packed my things to leave. He told me he didn't deserve forgiveness. He was right. I told him I didn't hate him, but I also told him I no longer recognized the man I married. Then I closed the door, gently, but firmly, and for the first time in years, I locked it from the inside. That night, I sat by the window, listening to the rain hit the glass. It wasn't victory I felt. It was clarity. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with applause or redemption. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of peace, solitude, and the chance to rebuild without fear. I planted a rose bush in the front yard the next morning, right where Henry used to sit, complaining about the neighbors and pretending the world owed him more. Every spring since then, those roses have bloomed bright red, stubborn, untamed, alive. They remind me of one thing I learned the hard way. Kindness without boundaries becomes permission, and the people who mistake your heart for weakness will always live long enough to regret it. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched your heart, even for a moment, please consider subscribing to Auntie Grace Stories. Every week, we bring you new tales of love, loss, and the quiet strength that lives inside us all. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that could happen to any of us.